A warm welcome to this talk in which I will present an overview of the European Union legislative framework on food safety, animal health, and plant health. I will deal with this subject in three parts. Firstly, I will provide an overview of the European Union food law. In a second part, I will speak briefly about the agri-food trade of the European Union. And thirdly, I will review how the European Union is controlling export and import of agri-food products. The European Union legislation on food can be characterized in five parts. At the heart of the legislation is Regulation 178/2002, which includes the general food law of the EU, the general principles of food law. It's also the regulation creating the European Food Safety Authority, EFSA, the risk assessor in the European Union, and the country which provides the legal basis for the RASF, the Rapid Alert System for Food and Feed. If we look at the secondary legislation, we have the first block, top right in my slide, is the food safety part. This is the entire food safety legislation, which is under the SPS agreement. Secondly, in yellow on the bottom of my slide on the right, we have the legislation on quality of food, on food information to consumers, and on particular nutritional needs. Thirdly, in blue, we have legislation on plant health, and animal welfare. And finally, in pink, the legislation on official controls, import regime, and the hygiene rules. Let's start with a brief overview of the food safety legislation. We have all the legislation on food improvement agents, food additives, flavorings, enzymes, and similar substances, which are added to food in a very specific intention. We have residues of pesticides, veterinary medicines, hormones. These are products which are not intended to be in food, but may find their way in food by way of residues. Legislation on contaminants, mycotoxins, heavy metals, dioxin and PCBs, and other environmental contaminants, nitrates. And the microbiological criteria like Listeria, Campylobacter, Salmonella, I could have put E. coli as well on the slides. Fifthly, on food safety, we have all the legislation in food contact materials, plastic materials, ceramic, cellulose, papers, inks, and others. Legislation on processes to treat the food, like the novel food regulation, genetically modified food, or legislation on the irradiation of foodstuffs. And finally, in the part on food safety, legislation on animal nutrition. In the next part, we have the legislation on food information to consumers, the labeling legislation, general principles of labeling, mandatory labeling requirements, nutrition labeling, which is mandatory on all prepared foodstuffs in the EU since 2016, the nutrition information, and the very important issue of front of pack labeling, where you can repeat the calories, sugars, and so on. And finally, the legislation on nutrition and health claims. These are the voluntary claims that you can make about a food, provided, of course, that it is scientifically substantiated. Nutrition claims, for instance, like low in fat, high in sugar, high in energy. Functional claims like calcium is good for your bones. And finally, the disease-related claims, like keeping the calcium example, calcium may reduce the risk of osteoporosis. So these are the legislation on food information to consumers. The second block is the legislation on food for particular nutritional needs, like food for specific groups, for baby food, for instance, or food for special medical purpose, food for high energy efforts, and then food fortification when you add minerals or drink vitamins to the food, and then the food supplements, which are supplements of vitamin or again minerals, which you can be selling separately as a complement to diet. The last part in this block is legislation on quality, a few directives on quality of products like fruit juices, coffee, sugars, blood milk, and you can see why we call them the breakfast directives, because they all relate very much with honey, jam, and marmalade to issues around the products for your breakfast, at least for a European continental breakfast. Very important legislation on organic production or organic farming, which is the subject of separate presentations in this workshop, and same with the legislation on geographic indication, which will also be presented by other speakers in the context of this workshop. This part on labeling food quality falls under the TBT agreement, the Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement of WTO, and because they are under TBT, there is no need for a scientific substantiation of this legislation to be acceptable under WTO rules. The next part is the part on plant health, animal health, and animal welfare. And again, there will be very important presentation in the context of this workshop on plant health on the one hand and animal health on the other hand. Animal welfare is not really discussed because this is an export seminar, and animal welfare, of course, may exist in countries to which we export, but in general, we are not applying animal welfare to imports of food, of agri-food commodities in the EU, although some animal welfare are actually applicable to imports from non-EU countries. The last part of the EU food legislation that I wanted to give you a brief overview is the legislation on official controls and on hygiene. This is, of course, very important for the food safety system in the European Union, but also for our exports. I will explain in a minute why it is so important for our export, but of course also very important for our import, because the import regime, how we treat import from non-EU countries, is in this part, and I will describe that in the next parts of my presentation. This is indeed the part on the agri-food trade of the European Union. If we look at the statistics, we see that the EU is the third largest importer of agri-food products, of agricultural commodities and foodstuffs. The largest importer in the world is China, in front of the US, then the EU and the UK, and fifth is Japan. If we look at what are the origin of the imports into the European Union, we can see that the United Kingdom is the largest supplier of agri-food to the European Union, in front of Brazil and the United States. And if we look at what we import, the categories, you can see that by far the largest category is the vegetable products, notably fruits and vegetables. Second is foodstuffs, and third is animal products. We import a lot of fish, of course, in the European Union. If we look at exports now, we see that the European Union is by far the largest export of agri-food products, and the difference with the others, with our competitors, USA, Brazil, China, and Canada, has increased significantly since the United Kingdom left the European Union, because all the trade with the United Kingdom is now regarded as the external trade of the EU. And if we look at the destination of EU export, you can see that indeed the United Kingdom is by far the largest customer, the largest destination of EU imports of agri-food products. The USA is a distant second, and then is China. And if we look at what we export from the EU, you can see that more than half of the EU exports of agri-food are foodstuffs, finished food, including beer and wine and alcohol and mineral water, a lot of drinks in this, but also biscuit, finished products, and so on. Enough by way of statistics. What is the regulatory framework for the EU trade in agricultural and food products? First, the EU itself and its 27 member states are all members of WTO and are bound when it comes to agricultural products by the SPS, Sanitary and Phytosanitary Agreement, and by the TBT agreement, the Agreement on Technical Barriers to Trade. And in particular, on the standards which are adopted by the three main international standard setting bodies under TBT and SPS, notably the Codex Alimentarius, which is very important for foodstuffs, the OIE, or in English, the World Animal Health Organization, which lays down the standards on animal health, of course, and thirdly, the IPPC, International Plant Protection Convention, which provides the standards and guidelines on plant health, which is very important, of course, for food trade, for agricultural food trade. On the other hand, the EU has entered in a number of bilateral treaties or agreements with non-EU countries. In the past, they were mainly veterinary agreements or equivalence agreements, and more recently, the EU has concluded free trade agreement or FTAs with Korea, Canada, Japan, and others. Singapore, we're negotiating with Mexico currently, and a few other countries. But the EU export and import are also regulated by the European food law itself, and notably by Regulation 178/2002, which I mentioned at the very beginning of this presentation. And I would like to draw your attention to Article 12 of Regulation 178/2002, which provides that food and feed exporters or re-exporters have to comply with the food safety requirements of the EU. This is unique. I don't know of any other country or region in the world which provides that you cannot export from the European Union a product which you could not place on the market in the European Union. I believe this is very important in the context of an export seminar like the one we are in today, in the sense that we can guarantee to you that we will not export to non-EU countries products which we could not place on the market in the EU from a food safety point of view. So this is extremely important in terms of a guarantee that we provide to our customers, to the destinies of our exports, that what we're exporting is safe, at least from the point of view of the EU. There is a similar provision in Regulation 178/2002 for imports. It provides that food and feed imported into the European Union for placing on the market in the EU must comply with the relevant requirements of EU food law. In other terms, if you want to export to the EU, you have to comply with all the food safety requirements which I've indicated in the first part of this presentation. And this is why I spent some time in showing you the EU food safety, animal health and plant health legislation. In other terms, we are not effectively implementing equivalence in terms of the applicable food safety standards to import in the EU. It would be impossible to do that. We import products from more than 180 countries around the world. It's not possible to assess the equivalence of all the food safety legislation I've mentioned with the corresponding legislation of all the exporters' countries' legislation. And even if we could, it would be a constant work in progress because we keep changing our legislation. Exporting countries are keeping changing the legislation, so we would constantly have to reassess the equivalence. However, whilst we do not implement equivalence for the food safety requirements themselves, the EU is very generous in recognizing the equivalence of the controls implemented in the exporting countries. We allow the exporting countries to have to authorize the establishments which can export to the EU. We allow them to control themselves, these establishments. We allow them to control themselves according to EU law that all the EU requirements have been met. And we recognize the certificates that the exporting countries are issuing so that we do not have to repeat these controls when the products arrive in the EU. In other terms, whilst we do not provide equivalence for the food safety requirements, we are recognizing that the controls which are made in the exporting countries to verify that EU safety requirements have been respected, we recognize these controls and the outcome of these controls, which is the veterinary certificate, the plant health certificate. So very important recognition of the equivalence of the controls in the exporting countries. In conclusion, I would say that on the one hand, the EU has one of the strictest food safety regulation in the world, but at the same time, it also has one of the most open and transparent import regime for the food safety products that we import. Thank you very much for your attention.